to the Russell Scott Show.
Dr. Walt Brown, welcome to the program.
Oh, good afternoon.
Dr. Walt Brown is the world's foremost expert in JFK research. He is the author of 6 books on the subject, including Treachery in Dallas and The Warren Omission. He has worked as a special agent for the Justice Department, has a Ph.D. in history, and is currently working on his 30,000-plus page Chronology of the JFK Assassination. He's also my good friend, and it's an honor to have him here on the show. Walt, where were you on the day Kennedy was shot?
Amazingly enough, I was a junior in high school, and we were on split sessions. So we were dismissed to go home Eastern Standard Time just as Kennedy's plane was leaving Fort Worth to go to Love Field. Amazingly enough, I got home in the house I still live in, and I frittered around. We didn't have any sports practice until the second session got out, and I was walking into town, and a woman just came over to me and told me, "Did you hear the president's been shot? She was shot in the head and doesn't look good." And in that minute, it was over. There was no waiting. There was no worrying. There was no nail biting. It was just a done deal. And I walked into the block, and there was a TV set in the window of a store, and Walter Cronkite was, making it official, which always to me made it sound like it was a new record in the long jump. And the last class I had, while John Kennedy was president, was English 3, and 37 years later, somebody I knew the English teacher I had, and I said, "Please, when you get a chance, say hello for me." So she did, and the guy said, "What's he up to?" She goes, "Oh, he's written, 9 or 14 books or something like that." The English teacher said, "I never thought he'd read 9 books," which is a heck of a recommendation. But I sent him a copy of one of the books, and he read it very carefully, and he graded it just the way he always graded things, and he was very pleased with it. But that was just a cold, gray afternoon in New Jersey. And when I've given talks back in the day when you were talking to people that remembered, 20 years ago, how many of you remember where you were when Kennedy was shot? And the audience all puts their hands up. And then the next question I said to them, how many of you remember where you were when you heard about it? And then they realized that's what they answered in the first question. Because what they remembered is where they were when they heard about it, not where they were at 12:30 Eastern Time or 12:30 Central Time, 1:30 Eastern. They wouldn't know. I know because I still live in the same house. And it's in its own way, it's haunting because I was here when it happened. And the work I've been doing, particularly the last 8 years, you said 31,000 plus now, is just being generated at the same site. But like I said, it was it was like a raw afternoon in New Jersey. And it hadn't been raw until the news came out. And I can still see that woman walking up to me. And I know exactly the spot where it happened. When I can't remember, then I'll know. And I better see the Alzheimer's doctor.
The story obviously starts far before the man was shot and killed.
Oh, absolutely.
So instead of asking you what happened on November 22nd, 1963, you've written this chronology. Let's look at it in a chronological way, and let's tell the story of the JFK assassination.
All right. Well,
by
first of all,
I mean you.
Yeah. Let's just put aside the Lee Oswald did it stuff, because there's more holes in that than there are anywhere else. And at the end of the day, part of the proof of what I would talk about is that he didn't do it. Going back to January 20th of 1961, I heard Kennedy's inaugural over the PA system in school. I was in 8th grade at that point. And I had just pulled for Kennedy like crazy. I was up until 5:30 in the morning at age 13 on election night till finally they conceded. And very few people know it, but the real clue that he was elected is when the head of the Secret Service made a phone call to Hyannisport to tell Secret Service agents to go to work, and he made a call to Los Angeles to tell them Nixon ain't getting a job, you can go home. That was what kind of made it official. And when you look back now on Kennedy's inaugural, it was a little bit militant. I mean, there was a stridency to it, in the sense of, we're not going to take any nonsense from people that decide they're going to be our enemies. But as with the passage of time and with the realization of what was happening, events came along, Kennedy came to realize that things were not as they seemed. One of the people that ran against Kennedy in the primaries was Stuart Symington. He was in the Senate in 1960, openly stating that we have to get going, and we have to get going, because within 1 year the Soviets will have 3,000 ICBMs in place. And Eisenhower, one of his gophers, came in and said, "You know what Symington just said?" So we said, "Well, let's find out." He called, of all people, Allen Dulles, the CIA, and said, "What are your projections for Soviet missile emplacement over the next year?" And Dulles said, "Well, by 1962 they might have a dozen." And Symington is saying 3,000. We were putting one nuclear delivery vehicle on site every day during Kennedy's 1,000 days. Either a Polaris missile submarine would be christened, or the Minutemen missiles were going into the ground. And the Cold War was just an absolute fraud. The Russians had fooled us with the propaganda stunts, putting Yuri Gagarin in space, and Sputnik. Their rocketry was essentially a bunch of bombs with tin cans on top, and if the bomb went off, the tin can went up and went into orbit. There was no sophistication whatsoever. And Kennedy learned that. The Russians killed off a number of astronauts before Gagarin finally succeeded. And when it came time for the showdown in Cuba in 1962, again, there was that stridency in Kennedy's voice, but there was a, fear or an anxiety behind it, because if, in fact, there were actual missiles in Cuba, and who knows, because those parades that used to go through Red Square with rockets, for all we know, they were tin cans. There's no way of knowing. If there were missiles in Cuba, we were in trouble. Because Kennedy knew, and the people that needed to know, knew that the Russians posed no threat to us whatsoever in terms of atomic warfare. None whatsoever. They were so badly outnumbered that it was useless for them to even imagine it. And I think one time when you and I were talking, I told you about what the Russians did at an air show. When they developed the new generation of bombers, they flew two formations over this air show, where, of course, Americans were invited and whatnot. And then those planes landed, and they changed the numbers on them, and they sent them up again. And they landed, and they sent them up again. The American observers sent home, the Russians have suddenly got 500 heavy bombers when they had 20. And then just the numbers are constantly being changed.
Mm-hmm.
And the Russians had no choice, because they didn't have the resources, the economic resources. And ultimately, the Cold War bankrupted the Soviet Union in 1989. It's not a pretty good job to do the same with us. But with the missiles in Cuba, there was the fear that something could go wrong. Something could go seriously wrong. And it almost did, because one U-2 airplane was called back when it was over Soviet airspace during the missile crisis. And of course the Russians would perceive that as a reconnaissance prior to an attack. And just as a coincidence, the second American U-2 that was shot down on November 21st, 1963, the day before the assassination, which allows for the thinking that there were plans for something with regard to Cuba on November 22nd, because they were going to catch a Cuban fanatic as the assassin. But the missile crisis really taught Kennedy a lesson. And what's going to happen? What happens if Houston, Phoenix, the places within range of those Cuban missiles, Washington, Miami, name 20 good-sized cities. You're talking about millions of people with no warning. absolutely no warning. That was serious business. Kennedy got a good look at what could have gone wrong. And of course, Kennedy had as good a first-hand war experience as anybody out there. As he used to say, the Japanese sunk my boat. He worked the rest of World War II for better and safer P-boats, but he was not a warrior in that sense. And after the missile crisis, when the intelligence estimates come in and he sees, we've got 1,000 missiles ready to go and we got 500 bombers on the runway, and the Russians have less than 1/10 of that, he knew. This has been a massive con job. There's no Cold War. And the missiles that we traded for in Turkey were supposed to have been removed months before. And when that became an issue, he looked at the Pentagon and he said, what are these guys doing? Who's in charge here? And he started moving away from the warlike footing. And he and Khrushchev started exchanging very personal and what were very pastoral letters. Not even speaking to issues, but just the beauty of nature, the wonders of the world, if it were not to be polluted. They just went back and forth, and they came to a mutual understanding that it's not our job, and it certainly wasn't the Soviets' job to blow up the world. But the people in the Pentagon wanted to go nuclear at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis. The group called XCOM, the Executive Committee, the room where they met, all of those meetings were tape recorded. And sometimes Kennedy just walked out and said, what are you people talking about? Bombing Cuba off the map. Come on. There's innocent people. And of course the tape went on running, and he heard what the Joint Chiefs had to say, and he didn't like what he heard. And one of those guys was honored on a postage stamp a couple of years ago, for, I guess, blowing up the world stamp collection. Arleigh Burke is the guy's name. He was the flag admiral. And once the dust settled from that, Kennedy just did a reversal and said, we can end the Cold War. We can save a heck of a lot of money because we don't need to spend the kind of money we do on armaments. That is still true 50 years later. There's other things that can be done with our resources. The American University speech of June 10th was, in a lot of people's eyes, the last straw. He just came right out and said, America is going to lead by example. We're not going to lead by muscle. And that made the muscle people extremely upset. The last straw on Kennedy's side of the ledger was when he lost his little boy in August of '63. In my own situation, the point where I came to when I was editing and indexing that part of the chronology, it took me one day to get through the life of Patrick Bouvier Kennedy, and it was very difficult. It really was. I could literally feel John Kennedy's pain, Mrs. Kennedy's pain, Clint Hill's pain, taking care of Mrs. Kennedy. Just unimaginable. Unimaginable. At that point, he said, it's about the children. The test ban treaty was signed because he didn't want fallout. Underground nuclear test is one thing, but an above-ground nuclear test is another matter altogether. And at that point, just for future reference, the story always is that Lyndon Johnson convinced Earl Warren to head the Presidential Commission, because if he didn't, facts could come out that would lead to 39 or 40 million people getting killed in a nuclear war. And the reality is it would have been about 1.5 billion people. If we launch on the Russians, and of course we would have had to, the fallout would have killed the subcontinent of India, China, Japan, Indonesia, populations like we can't imagine. But Kennedy was aware of all of that, and he started drawing it in. And he said to the Russians, let's have a joint space program, save money. And what stopped it was two things. One, the assassination, and two, the Russian scientists were not really eager to get involved in that because they knew they didn't have technology that we had. And they knew that they were never going to get to that point. So things are all going in one direction, and it's a direction that the Pentagon really was not particularly excited about. And out of that grew the movement to remove Kennedy. And that's the lead up. And then it was just a matter of compartmentalizing it so that it could be done without being obvious about it. You and I have talked about the suspects. Well, the mob did it, the driver did it, the CIA. The CIA's failures vastly outnumber their successes. At the end of the day, I'm convinced that the military did it for a number of reasons. One, to keep themselves going. Two, to vastly improve their opportunities. Because if we're going to bring the troops home from Vietnam, that's bad news for the military. That's horrible news. I always cite the example of Custer's last stand. Custer died a colonel in 1876. 13 years earlier, when he was in his 20s, he was a general in the Civil War. But when the military was retrenched after the Civil War, you didn't need that many generals. And they just bumped people down. And
peace is bad for the war business.
Oh, absolutely. Peace is not good for business. And it's not good for military contractors who are only too happy to grease legislative palms. But if the president isn't going to sign the bill, the lobbyists aren't going to leave the bundles of cash on the doorstep. But there were, and you could literally put the number in the thousands. There were thousands of second lieutenants, first lieutenants, captains, majors, could imagine that if Vietnam were to become a war, the first lieutenant was probably going to wind up a major. The captain might wind up a one-star general. The colonel certainly would become general. And this was an opportunity not to be missed, because we've always had to have an enemy. Fascism, communism. Now they've gone one better and made it an invisible enemy, and it's terrorism. Whether it's somebody from Iraq or Timothy McVeigh, it's still the unseen enemy. And because of that, 8 billion people have taken off their shoes in an airport. But Vietnam was the opportunity with no questions asked. Because America doesn't lose wars. The contractors were salivating. People in the Pentagon were as eager as they could possibly be. And the president wanted no part of it. There's one question remaining. Would the vice president go for it? Lyndon Johnson was very hawkish in the ex-com meetings when Kennedy was not there, all on the side of the generals. For the most part, Lyndon Johnson probably didn't say 100 words at all of the meetings he was present with in groups with Kennedy for the entire time he was vice president. He sat there silent. When Kennedy wasn't there, he let his identity be known. So now you literally, somebody has given the go-ahead. Because we know if the vice president becomes president, the war will go.
1,000 Americans a month will get slaughtered?
Yeah. Some of my friends, people I still think about. Bad as as horrible as, for instance, Verdun and the Somme offensive were in World War I, and as horrible as Stalingrad or the fall of Berlin, Vietnam was a nightmare. It was just a different kind of nightmare. You didn't know who the enemy was, but you killed the water buffalo anyhow. Just this absolute senseless slaughter. We lost 58,000, we killed 1 million and lost. How does that work? The generals got what they wanted, but the privates and the corporals and the sergeants, they didn't want it as bad as the generals did. As they said in Oliver Stone's movie, the circle is tightening around Kennedy. He's got all kinds of unseen enemies. And they're powerful people. They're people that have enough corporate strength. Yesterday, perfect timing. The corporations stalled Chuck Hagel yesterday. Former Republican senator, arguably the best guy imaginable to run the Pentagon. They don't want that. They want somebody that's going to just sign checks. They don't want somebody that's going to ask questions about whether it's right or wrong. And Chuck Hagel, in his own way, is a microcosm of Kennedy in terms of accountability and, you know, the most bang for the buck. And is it right? So certainly by the time Kennedy lost his son in October, when he went ahead with the National Security Action Memorandum 263, which was going to begin the withdrawal from Vietnam, the forces had gathered to get ahead of the story. What happens when it happens? What's Johnson going to do? What's Hoover going to do? The head of the Secret Service is meaningless. He's a functionary. Hoover hated Kennedy. Johnson hated Kennedy. I've always said, turn the situation around. Imagine that Lyndon Johnson was the President of the United States, John Kennedy was Vice President, and in a motorcade through Boston, Massachusetts, Lyndon Johnson was killed. John Kennedy becomes President. In those conditions, I would guarantee there would be an investigation under every rock in Massachusetts until they knew the whole story. But instead, the event happens in the home of the Vice President, who happens to be a different Vice President, Texas, Johnson. The killer was convicted before the sun set. No investigations were conducted. And there are instances where Dallas police officers got time off so that they could moonlight and drive the news people around to get their stories. Not only were they not investigating, they weren't even showing up for work. I mean, first of all, November 22nd was a normal work day in Dallas, Texas. If you were off that day, it was your day off. If you wanted to call in sick, you called in sick. The entire security, such as it was done by the traffic division. They're not trained to watch for killers. They're guys that blow whistles and stop traffic. That was it. There was no extra manpower put on. There were no detectives on the motorcade route. There were a few detectives at the trademark. So there's nothing happening there. It's easily predictable that Hoover is not going to do anything of a serious nature, because to do so would have been pleasing to Robert Kennedy, and he wasn't going to about to do anything pleasing to Robert Kennedy. And Hoover wanted Kennedy out of there because it was his job. Hoover would have been out of power if Kennedy had been reelected. Hoover was born January 1st of 1895, and mandatory retirement was 70. There's plenty of places you can read that Hoover would have had to retire on January 1st, 1965, and it's wrong. The law was you had to retire on the last day of the month in which you turned 70. So he would have retired on January 29th, which was the last Friday of January 69. Hoover, he was a power unto himself. The FBI building was called the seat of government. And of course there have been stories about Hoover and Clyde Tolson. And towards the end, Tolson said to Hoover one time, you know, would you mind if I had a burial plot arranged to be near you? And Hoover said, don't trouble yourself. I'm only going to be needing mine for 3 days. And of course, there's Johnson. You know, is Johnson going to push an investigation? And even if there'd been a suspicion that he would have, if you make it happen in Texas, you can't. Because it's going to turn up too much stuff that nobody wants revealed. The sub-government of the United States on November 21st was the Texas Taliban. The Secretary of the Navy had been Fred Korth, who had been the attorney when Marguerite Oswald essentially lost the divorce settlement to her third husband. He was the husband's attorney, and then he became Secretary of the Navy. And he was connected to the banks that made the loans for the TFX, which was going bad in Texas. Roswell Gilpatrick was Deputy Secretary of Defense. He was connected to those banks and those loans. And one of the Warren Commission senior attorneys became president of General Dynamics, which was the TFX. And meanwhile, he's investigating the murder of the guy that would have pulled the plug on the project. So they had to know that the pieces were in place, and the Texas trip was ideal. When you posit all of that stuff, then you have to say to yourself, if what I'm saying has any validity, and I'll admit this, people they'll say, it's exaggerated. I don't believe it is. I think it's understated. But if you're going to put all of those situations in place, are you going to leave the actual event to Lee Oswald? I mean, here's the guy that was lousy with a gun when he had a good gun in the Marines. And that's factual testimony. He had no rifle practice, and marksmanship is one sport where you got to practice, practice, and practice. You walk away for 2 weeks, you lose your edge. And we could spend an hour talking about why he couldn't have done it. Not didn't do it, couldn't have done it. So the military moves in. In Oliver Stone's movie, one of the things that was said was the military always has a presence on the ground when the president travels. But they didn't for the Kennedy trip to Dallas. Well, they did.
They did, yeah.
They did, but it was a different kind of presence. The first real overt act came from Michael Payne, Ruth Payne's husband, and a friend of his, a co-worker. They got a hold of somebody named J.D. Wilmuth. Wilmuth spoke Russian, and he contacted Ruth Payne and said, I understand you have a woman that speaks Russian living with you. She said, yes, I do. And she said, I'm learning Russian. He said, I'd love to hear what somebody sounds like who's lived in Archangel, where Marina was born. Can I come by? And she said, sure. Well, J.D. Wilmuth showed up at the Payne house with Ruth and Marina and the kids on November 19th. We'll get back to him. On November 22nd, the car in front of Curry's car, Jesse Curry's was the third car in the motorcade, Kennedy was fourth. There's a car that goes through 2 miles ahead of everybody. And it was driven by the traffic division captain, Purdue Lawrence. He's got to make sure that every corner is covered. The numbers of people for a motorcade, as long as it was, a given cop had to stop traffic at this corner, then run, get on his motorcycle, take the back roads 2 miles ahead, and stop traffic when he got there, ahead of the motorcade. And that was what's called the pilot car. The car 250 yards ahead of Curry was the advance car. And that had 2 Dallas detectives, plus Deputy Chief Lumpkin, George Lumpkin, and a man named George Whitmire. It's Whitmire is his last name. And their job is to make sure everything is absolutely finalized. Everything is just as it should be. And of course, the people that were on the triple underpass should never have been there, against every imaginable Secret Service regulation. Because too much can go wrong. Even if unintended, too much can go wrong. And that car made its way through the motorcade route. It only stopped once, at the corner of Elm and Houston Street, on the left-hand side, opposite the Sexton building, which housed the company called the Texas School Book Depository Company. Mm-hmm. They stopped. They briefly had an exchange with one person standing on a corner, and then they went on. And because they lost time talking to this guy, they didn't stop and get those people off the triple underpass, which was just as well because they were a necessary distraction. The guy standing on a corner took a number of photographs. And there was a reason he was at that corner to take photographs. His name was Jim Powell. Later that afternoon, the Dallas cops and the Dallas County Sheriff, and Dallas County Sheriff's, his responsibilities are any law enforcement infractions outside of city limits. They don't operate within city limits, which is why he didn't have any of his sheriff's deputies involved in the motorcade. They were all standing on Main Street at the corner of Houston when the shots were fired, and they all ran around the corner and followed the crowd up to the grassy knoll. It's not like everybody that ran thought the shots came from the grassy knoll. The first few did, and everybody followed them. Mm-hmm. When the cops brought Marina and Ruth Payne in for interrogation, a man named Jack Crichton said, listen, I'll get somebody to translate. And he called somebody named Ilya Mamontov to translate Marina Oswald's Russian. And everything that was said Ruth Payne in the room. That's, in essence, where the story ends, except there was a presence, a sizable presence, in Dealey Plaza. And the proof is a guy named Robert Croft. He was a missionary, 20-year-old missionary, who had been doing missionary work, that's what missionaries do, in Arkansas. And he was going home to Colorado by train. And the train stopped at noon in Dallas. And he said, well, I got an hour to kill. I'll take some pictures. And when he walked out of Union Station, which is 3 blocks south of Dealey Plaza, he saw a crowd of people. What's going on? Oh, Kennedy's here. Oh, fantastic. He goes running over. He took pictures during the shooting. And he believed his 4th picture was taken just at the time Kennedy was shot. Just at it was shot in the head. Mm-hmm. And he looked at his watch and, oh my God, I got to get my train. He went running back, got on the train, went to Denver, Colorado. The FBI found him the next morning at 10 o'clock. How do you do that? Nobody is that good. The only way that could have happened is somebody that was in Dealey Plaza saw this guy take off running. He was followed. Somebody got on a train with him, followed him all the way to Denver, and then called the local office and said, you want to talk to this guy? You were taking pictures yesterday when the president was shot. Oh, how do you know that? Well,
we know everything.
We're paid investigators. It's our job to know that. And he surrendered his film, and he got back a couple of the pictures that he took, but he didn't get them all back. That's key, too. Now, who are all these people? Go back to the beginning. J.D. Wilmuth. He was a colonel in Army intelligence. He had served in the Moscow legation, obviously in Moscow, as early as 1944, doing intelligence activities in Russia. Totally, absolutely beyond question, fluent in Russian, had a Ph.D. in Russian, taught Russian at a local university, no doubt to help generate spies or whatever. His job was to go to Marina and Ruth and simply say, listen, the sky is going to fall this week. Get used to it. Either go along with what happens or you're taking your chances. So he was there paying a courtesy call to the two of them. Because of all people on God's green earth, he's the last guy that needed to listen to what somebody sounded like from Archangel. He could tell you all the different dialects. That was his job. He knew. He didn't have to be there, except he was on a mission. The 2 people I mentioned in the front seat of the car, Lumpkin and Whitmire, they were the co-directors of the Army intelligence that would have been in a protective scenario had there been one. One of them is the deputy chief of Dallas Police. The other one is just simply East Sector co-commander. Mm-hmm. So Army intelligence was there, in a sense, not to be there. James Powell, the guy they stopped and talked to on the corner, was at that corner out of a 10 or 12 mile motorcade route. So people don't realize, if you take Love Field and imagine that's 12 o'clock, the Trade Mart was 10 o'clock. But the motorcade essentially went from 12 past 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way around to 10. To go back, they only had to go from 10 to 12. And for what it's worth, you cannot find motorcade assignments of traffic officers to get Kennedy back to Love Field. The only assignments were made were to get him to the Trade Mart. To me, they weren't planning on a second ride of Kennedy in the car. The guy on the corner, James Powell.
Wow, that's a pretty big one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The guy in the corner, James Powell, was a special agent in Army intelligence. His job, more than anything else, was to make sure that he saw Oswald in the window. Then they knew the patsy was in place. We got the guy that we want where we want him. Because Oswald went 15 miles out to the Payne residence on Thursday night. if he had gotten sick, or if his driver, Wesley Frazier, had gotten the flu overnight, or if Wesley Frazier's 1953 Chevy had broken down, what would have happened? No Oswald, no Patsy. But they had to know, not only was he there, but that he was in place. That was Powell's job. And then Powell took pictures of the south face of the book depository immediately after the shooting was all done. The two most famous pictures of that wall, one was taken by Tom Dillard, who was in one of the camera cars, because a guy named Bob Jackson said, "I think I see a gun up there." And Jackson didn't have any film left in his camera. It's the end of the motorcade. And Dillard did. He took a Dillard picture, and it was similar to Powell's picture. And of course, Dillard's picture got overheated in the processing, and it came out a little warped. But there's no Powell could not have been allowed to take a picture with somebody in the window with a gun, because it wouldn't have been Oswald. And then later on in the afternoon, you get, I said, a guy named Jack Crichton. He gets a hold of Ilya Mamontoff. Jack Crichton was Army intelligence. So the Dallas police didn't wind up getting the translator. Army intelligence supplied the translator, and Mamontoff was connected to elements of Army intelligence, and the suspicion is, you can't prove it, but the suspicion is that his translations were more injurious to Lee Oswald from Marina than what her actual words were. I used to do sarcasm, comedy, whatever, and I'd say, just imagine Marina being questioned. How did your husband treat you? And then the Russian translator asks, Marina, when you and Lee played dominoes, what happened? And Marina's answer is, he beat me. And it comes out very negative, because the question doesn't match the answer. You know, Marina, how would you categorize your husband with a rifle? And the translator says to Marina, what can you buy for $2 in Jack Ruby's bar? She answers, a good shot. So those things fall into place. Now, Jack Crichton has an extremely colored reputation. After the assassination, he was one of, literally, the Texas Taliban that ran for office to take over the state of Texas. George H.W. Bush ran for office that year. The mayor, the Dallas mayor who was in the motorcade, who, by the way, was a ceremonial figure. The city manager was the guy that managed Dallas. He wasn't even around. Crichton, Bush, and Cabell, the brother of the CIA guy fired, they all ran for office in '64, and the two biggies lost. But Crichton, his history was that he had been in a partnership, a sponsored partnership, with George de Mohrenschildt, and that's a very familiar name in the Oswald story. In the late 1950s, he and de Mohrenschildt tried to buy oil leases that would have covered literally half of the land area of Cuba. Now that's a serious bunch of money, and that's big oil. When Crichton failed to get elected in the fall of '64, he got a position, an executive position, literally his own oil company, and the only person he was accountable to in that business was somebody named D.H. Byrd, who was a big oil person in Texas. And D.H. Byrd just happened to own the Texas School Book Depository building. And when the sniper's window was removed from that building, that window was a venerated shrine at D.H. Byrd's house until he died in 1986. And then it was put back in a glass case in the depository. But make no mistake, that was a triumph. So Crichton, he's wrong from top to bottom. Mamontoff goes back and gets big-time work in oil geology. And then the same day, the Texas authorities go looking, who knows anything about Lee Oswald? And they said, Army Intelligence has a file on him. Well, Army Intelligence had a file on Henry Lee Oswald, who lived at 605 Elsbeth Street, which was just knocked down, by the way, that building. Oswald lived at 602, and of course he wasn't Henry Lee. And the story was, and it was just accepted for what it was as stated, they had a file, the Army Intelligence had a file on Oswald, but the file was destroyed while it was being thermofaxed. Now, if you break that story down into its components, it doesn't ride. I don't know if you can remember or your listeners can remember, but in the old days, when you thermofax something, it meant at your end, you put one piece of paper into a cylinder, and the thing spun, which was connected to a phone line. And at the other end, they had to take the phone and stick it into a machine, and the thing would generate an image at the other end. It was like long-distance Xerox, or, prehensile fax machine.
Mm-hmm.
But the file was destroyed while being thermofaxed. Well, that's nonsense, because you only send one page at a time. It's not like they put 48 pages in the machine and cooked them. But they bought it. Oh, well, yeah, the file was destroyed by being thermofaxed. That's like just, jotting off Lee Oswald was fluent in Russian. He wasn't fluent in English. But if you say it casually enough, the file was destroyed while being thermofaxed. The last phone call, people kept asking Oswald, do you have an attorney? Well, I want to reach John Apt. And what Lee Oswald was thinking about, I have no idea. Because you couldn't have picked a worse attorney. I mean, he defended every communist that ever got in trouble in the United States. Oswald might as well have had a bullseye sewn onto his shirt when he wanted John Apt. But he was allowed to make phone calls. And the last phone call he attempted to make was to a number in North Carolina. And the operator put the call through, told Oswald, who of course is calling from a cell or a cell block area, the party isn't answering. And they had two men in suits listening in, and there was a second operator. The second operator signed an affidavit that the call was never even put through. But Oswald was told, the party isn't answering. The calls went to a guy named John Hurt in North Carolina, who was a big shot in Army intelligence. That's a hell of a coincidence. I mean, if I'm Lee Oswald and I'm an ex-Marine and I'm upset about my discharge, why would I call somebody in Army intelligence? Call somebody around the corner that's a lawyer. But I think Oswald started to realize nobody was going to come riding to his rescue.
That's right.
And he was set up. That's why when a cop came running, when a cop pulls over a guy walking along the street as a possible suspect for presidential assassination, that's set up well in advance. The last guy you're gonna roust is somebody walking along with his hands in his pockets. But they did, and what happened happened. Then fast forward, who's the ultimate bad guy on the ground for the Warren Commission? And not Warren or Dulles, because they were figureheads. Who's the bad guy on the ground? All inspector. Where'd he come from? Army intelligence. The circle is complete. Pause for commercial.